Well, let me just thank John and these two for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. The paper's divided into two parts. The first part is highly theoretical. It's the sort of philosophy that's been criticized earlier today as sort of navel-gazing based on thought experiment sort of stuff. But I do that. And then the last part tries to apply or illustrate, perhaps would be better, some of the more theoretical claims by thinking about ethical, moral issues that arise concerning profiling. The unifying theme of the papers presented at this conference is this question of how consequences that are not seen, or it seems to be better to say hard to see, right? Because as Jeff suggested, if they're really not seen at all, you're not taking them into account. They've got to at least be possible to be considered, and I'll say more about that in a second. Anyway, how these consequences could be nevertheless critically relevant to truths about what we morally ought to do. The question itself might seem to presuppose, does seem to presuppose, it seems to me, that consequences are relevant to considerations concerning what one ought to do. And the simplest ethical theory that makes consequences relevant to considerations of what one ought to do is act consequentialism. The view, roughly, that defines the right action in terms of the best consequences, though, as we'll see in a second, there are all kinds of variations on that theme. But I also want to stress that there are deontological views, there better be, deontological views that still leave room for a prominent role for consideration of consequences to play. I think by far the most sophisticated deontologist was Ross. He has all these prima facie duties, these prima facie reasons to act in certain ways. But one of them was the duty of beneficence, the prima facie duty to bring about the best consequences, just one among others, and the prima facie reason you have to avoid bad consequences. And those will come in different strengths, I would assume, depending on how bad or how good the consequences are. And that's why even on a deontological view like Ross's, you do get to break promises and lie and kill innocent people and do all sorts of other things depending on how extreme the circumstances are, how significant the consequences are. Okay, so as I said, the basic idea behind consequentialism is that one ought to do what one ought to do, the right thing to do, is a function of the consequences of the alternatives open to one. As I said, crudely, one ought to choose that alternative that has the best or least bad consequences. But you get different versions of consequentialism depending on how you understand the relevant consequences. You also need a theory about what it means for something to be intrinsically valuable, have intrinsic positive or negative value. You also need a theory about what kinds of things are intrinsically good and intrinsically bad. And as we'll see in a moment, critically, you'll need a theory about probability, because you don't want to define the right thing to do in terms of the actual consequences of alternatives open to you. There are all sorts of, I think, compelling thought experiments that convince you pretty quickly that just because an act has the best consequences, it doesn't follow that it was the right thing to do. You can get, as Hobbes pointed out, trying to respond to the fool, you can get really lucky. Do something really stupid, and it can work out really well. This doesn't mean you acted as you should. It doesn't mean you did the right thing. So the view I favor is a version of expected utility, or expected value, consequentialism. Like to give it my own label just because there's certain presuppositions of my view that are different from the standard view. But basically the idea, I call it value-adjusted possible consequence. Consequentialism. It's the idea that the right action to perform is that action such that the sum of the adjusted values of the possible consequences of taking that action is greater than the sum of the adjusted values of the possible consequences of choosing any alternative. On the standard model, right, one adjusts the value that attaches to some possible consequence of what one is doing by multiplying the value by the probability. But I want to stress, and this applies to some of the things other people have said, it's sort of an as-if theory. I don't think the consequentialist believes, hope they don't believe, that there's some very precise scale for measuring positive value or negative value. We can make comparative judgments pretty easily, but putting them on a scale where the positive integers represent a degree of positive value, the negative degree of negative value, that's a kind of metaphor. And the probability assignments as well. You could talk about numerical probabilities, but I don't think those are the kinds of probabilities you want to be thinking about in the first place. I don't think you should understand the probability as so-called objective probability reflecting statistical regularities, statistical frequencies. Nor do I think you should think of it in terms of subjective probability, where that's a measure of the degree of credence you have that a given outcome will occur. I think the probability you need is what epistemologists call epistemic probability. Probability relative to evidence. And of course, evidence changes from person to person, from time to time. There are ambiguities there as well. But because I think of it in terms of epistemic probability, I don't really buy into that distinction that some of you are making between situations in which you can apply a theory of decision-making under risk and situations where you just don't know anything at all about what the consequences will be. There's always a fact, it seems to me, about what's epistemically likely relative to your evidence. I don't think it's measurable on a scale, but even when people were trying to describe situations in which they didn't want to think there was some assignment of numerical probability, I was struck by the fact that it would creep into your discussion. Jeff was trying to describe a situation in which it's not possible to figure out the potentially enormous, the probability of the potentially devastating effects of global warming. And then you started talking about, so they have about 5% chance, right? 5% probability. You were doing something by way of calculating probabilities, and if you couldn't, I don't even think you could think rationally about the whole thing. The theory, how many do you have?
You have 7 minutes.
8 minutes. 8.
Like all versions of consequentialism, one can worry that the theory might become completely useless. There are actually more possible consequences than there are actual consequences, so the task of figuring out what the right thing to do is intimidating. There are a couple of responses I think one might make. First, the fact that it's hard to figure out what you ought to do is not necessarily a defect of the theory. It is hard to figure out what you ought to do in life. You don't want it to be impossible for the theory to be action guiding in any sense. And one thing that might help might be to introduce a kind of derivative conception of rationality or morality. So you've got this root-based conception of what the right thing to do is. When you're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, you got to stop your calculations at a certain point in time. You can't think forever before acting. Sometimes you can't think very long at all before acting. When you stop, it seems to me often, you'll be in a position where something you're considering is taking the lead, so to speak, when it comes to alternative actions open to you. The consequences you have been able to consider favor one action over the rest. And at that point, there's a sense in which it has the best chance for you, relative to the calculations you've done, of being the right thing. You can call that right too. The right thing for you to do is what has the best chance of being the right thing in that fundamental sense. The right thing for you to do. And you can actually go up indefinitely many levels of this. Something might have the best chance of having the best chance of being the right thing to do, and that's another sense in which you can talk about the theory guiding your actions. The other thing I think that's worth thinking about, and this really does relate to remote consequences to a certain extent, is that for every really, really, really good and really, really, really bad possible consequence, they wash each other out most of the time. So you're trying to figure out whether to have a kid, momentous decision in life, lots of consequences too. Kids have kids and they have kids, and before you know it, the world is littered with your descendants. And you gotta worry. Some of them might be the next Adolf Hitler, really bad. But then one of them might be the person who stops the next Adolf Hitler, really good. They're both so unlikely, you discount the value, it's a wash. Inductively, it seems to me, you can sometimes reach the conclusion that you don't have to worry about that sort of very, very unlikely consequence. You should really be back to thinking about whether you want to spend half your afternoon taking kids to a soccer practice and having to watch the whole thing. Not to mention swim meets that are worse than soccer practices. But fun, all things considered.
This is being recorded for your children.
I know, I just had a little bit of a nightmare of my grandchildren hearing me say what I just said.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, to profiling. Oh, well, no, let me add one more thing. So again, the emphasis was on unseen remote consequences. I think the hidden consequences are hidden in the sense that difficult to see consequences are probably better conceptualized as those that are very unlikely. And as Jeff said, that's not a temporal thing. I mean, there can be immediate, relatively immediate possible consequences that have a very low likelihood of occurring, but nevertheless you're irrational if you don't take them into account. This is not a rational worry, but I don't like flying. And I can't get that possible consequence of that plane descending in a fiery crash to my nasty death out of my mind. I don't think it should be an overwhelming consideration, but it's silly to think that it's not a reason not to fly. And it has nothing to do with being remote. Very remote consequences are, I think, sometimes difficult. They're not difficult to foresee. The probability is just very low. And because people have perhaps sometimes a tendency to overlook the very unlikely, they might have a propensity to not factor in properly those remote possible consequences. All right, profiling. I'm going to have to be very quick on this because I must be close to running out of time.
2 minutes.
Well, how hard could it be? The basic thrust of what I want to say about profiling is that while it's fraught with all sorts of perils, there's nothing epistemically irrational about profiling. You can define the practice in such a way that you mean by forming a belief through profiling, forming an irrational belief. If you don't prejudice the issue that way, it seems to me there's all sorts of perfectly sensible ways of profiling. It's just, in a way, statistical reasoning. If you're a Humean at all, the idea Hume had was once you go beyond what's directly evident to you, not much is directly evident to you, you're going to use inductive reasoning. Profiling is just inductive reasoning. You can use it badly. You can rely on generalizations that you aren't justified in believing. Garbage in, garbage out. You can fail to be sophisticated by taking into account all the different reference classes, groups to which a person belongs. That's bad. You can confuse something having a greater likelihood with its being likely. That's bad. You can easily reach conclusions about false cause. That's bad. But that just means you can profile badly. It's a separate question, though, as to whether the practice of profiling, whether to put into place practices like, say, stop and frisk, or stopping certain groups disproportionately driving a car, whether that's a good idea. And there, it seems to me, the more subtle consequences might get overlooked. If you're just trying to prevent crime, or trying to stop a terrorist attack from people flying into the nation, if you're just focused on that, and they're not irrelevant considerations, it's going to seem like a really obviously rational thing to do. But people get upset when they're profiling, and being upset is generally speaking a bad thing. You don't want to upset people. It's also the case that at least some people you're trying to profile, you think of terrorists as well, they catch on, right? If you're only going to look carefully at certain groups and not others, they're going to, presumably, they don't strike me as the sharpest knives in the drawer, but they're eventually going to start changing their tactics and trying to find people who look more like middle-aged people from Iowa to carry on a bomb or some other device on a plane. I'm out of time, but the gist of it is, if you're going to argue against profiling, the suggestion is don't do it based on the irrationality of beliefs. Do it based on the overlooking of subtle, perhaps very unlikely, long-term consequences that will be bad from engaging in practices based on these beliefs. Thanks.